Oops. So, sorry. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. For those of you who have seen my other webinars, you already know this, but please submit questions in the GoToWebinar console. All questions will be answered at the end, and slides and recordings will be shared out after the webinar. The agenda for today is to briefly go over what is Open Labs. Then we're going to go over what are artifacts and what artifacts are available. We're going to deep dive into specifically the elements, the VDRs, and the formulas within the Open Labs repos and how to use them. So to start with, what is Open Labs? Open Labs is an open source organization with a handful of repos. Each repo has a very specific topic or purpose. Under a single organization, all these repos become what is known as Open Labs. Today, we're specifically focusing on artifacts, and artifacts are smaller repos within the Cloud Elements organization. So there are larger standalone repos such as the Doctor, Heimdall, and what we will soon be having, which is implementation reference repo. And all of these are standalone repos that can be used on their own. The artifacts are smaller repos, such as the elements repo, the VDR repo, and the formulas repo, that can have examples of artifacts that exist there but can be imported into the Cloud Elements UI or used via Cloud Elements API. And they're all small little pieces that don't stand alone. So we're going to get started with the elements repo, and we're going to go over how to move an element from Open Labs to Cloud Elements, how to edit the elements you upload, and how to give the updated element back to the community. Before we dive into the GitHub repo, I'm going to go over the setup and structure of the repo so that you can kind of get familiar with what is expected and how to look for the elements you're looking for. And then after we go over this, I will reiterate it within the repo. So in the repo, we expect the folders to be capitalized, alphabetical. The folders are named with the element or connector name. So if you are building, let's say, a box element, the folder will be named box, so it's very clear just by opening the repo what you're looking for. There should be a file inside of the folder with a README that lists the resources that are available and any specific gotchas or general information that might be helpful to know about that element. And then at very minimum, the element JSON must be there. In addition, there might, in some cases, be an import.json file and a JavaScript file. This is if you use the Doctor to download these. You might get these additional files that break apart those JavaScript, because in a typical JSON, element JSON, the JavaScript will be stringified. So if you prefer to break it apart so that the JavaScript can be opened in a text editor and more easily read and viewed, then you can use the Doctor to download these and break them apart. So in some cases, you might see both formats. Okay, so we're just going to dive right over to the repo. So this is the Cloud Elements organization, and as I mentioned, within this, you can see this elements repo. And in this repo, you can see what elements are available. Some of these elements are elements that are unavailable in Cloud Elements, and some of them are extensions of what's available in Cloud Elements. So for example, if I'm looking at ADP Workforce Now, which is the top element, this is not available in the Cloud Elements repo. So someone has built this element on their own as a private element using our element builder, and then added it to this GitHub repo so that anyone in the community who needed this element could come here and access it and upload it into their Cloud Elements account and work with it. In addition, some of these might be ones that we have in the Cloud Elements catalog, but maybe they are extended, or there's a reason that they've been added into here. So for example, we have a SendGrid element, but if you look down in this, there's a SendGrid v3 element. So in this particular case, this person has chosen to make a new element for a different version of SendGrid, SendGrid's APIs that were available and they needed. So in any case, because there's a README in each one of these, you can open one and you can get an idea of what's available. as well as why the element might have been built. So if it is an extended element, it'll go through and explain what resources were added and maybe why they extended it, because maybe those resources aren't available in Cloud Elements. So in this case, since this is not an extended element, it'll just list all of the available resources. And so a workflow that maybe someone would take would be to first, if they're in their Cloud Elements account, and let's say I needed a Wells Fargo element. And so I looked in Cloud Elements catalog and I noticed, hey, Cloud Elements doesn't have a Wells Fargo element. The next steps that I might take would be to come over to the GitHub repo and see if someone has put it in this elements repo. So in this case, I chose an example I knew was here, but there is a there's a Western Union element here at the bottom. So what I can do is if I have forked and cloned this repo, which I have, then I can get started. If you haven't, then you'll just come up here, you'll hit this fork button. What this does is it makes a copy of this Open Labs this Open Labs elements repo into your private GitHub. So this would make a jmat/elements in my private private GitHub repo. And then I have a copy of this Cloud Elements Open Labs repo that I can work with. I would then go to my copy of this. So in my repositories, I'll have this elements repo, and I can go ahead and clone that. And you would do that by coming over here and grabbing this clone or download. You could copy that, and then you just in your command line say git in the folder that you want it in, clone, and then you paste that that thing that you copied straight from GitHub, and then you would have a copy of that locally. I already have a copy of this locally, so I'm not going to go through that. But essentially, if I wanted to then upload that an element to Cloud Elements, I could just click this build a new element and I'll import it. Because I've cloned this to my local computer, I have that element available. So I can just click from computer and I know where I cloned that to. So in Jamie Thorson, Open Labs, elements, I have all of the elements that were in that Open Labs repo that I cloned, and I'm just going to choose Western Union. And then I'm going to grab the element JSON, and I'm going to import that. I can also use the doctor to import this, which was gone over in the last webinar series. So if I chose to use the doctor instead of if I was going to import a lot of elements, maybe I would import them using the doctor. In this case, because I'm just using one, for me, it's just as easy to click through the UI. But then I can click continue import, and this will import that element and all of the resources that are available into my personal Cloud Elements account. What I'm going to do while this loads is just hop over to the Open Labs repo and show you one thing that is useful. So if I look at this Western Union element that I'm importing, it should have all of the resources that are available listed here. So it gives a note about vendor documentation. If it's available, there'll be a link to the vendor documentation. In this case, it says that you have to contact Western Union to get access to their vendor documentation, so there's no link available. And then it lists the resources that are available to work with. So now if I go over to my Cloud Elements, I see those same resources came up as being able to be imported in this element. I can select all of them, or if I know there's only certain resources that I want, I can just choose the resources that are most useful for my use case. And then I'll just go ahead and hit import. And what this does is takes that Western Union element and makes a copy of it into my Cloud Elements account that I now have access to work with. I can extend it. I can offer it to my customers, and all of the resources that were there can be found in this resource tab. So at this point, now I have an element that I didn't otherwise have. And if I was in my elements catalog, I can see this element's there. It's labeled as a private element, but I still have access to it and I can still authenticate. One thing that's important to note is that oftentimes, and especially with OAuth 2 elements, if you immediately try to authenticate, and you're going to make an instance and you hit create, you might notice an error. And your first thought might be, well, this element doesn't even work. But because it's an OAuth2 element, oftentimes OAuth2 elements require an API key and secret. But if I'm building an element that my users are going to authenticate against, I might hard code those in as a default, but I would want to take them out when I uploaded this to GitHub. So it's always important to look in this hide optional, because you might also want to make this an optional field if your users are going to authenticate against it. So in the configuration, you can just look at where we have API key and secret, and you can put default values in. If you're going to share it back to the GitHub repo, though, make sure you remove these from the JSON so you're not uploading API keys and secrets to an open source repo. Okay, so then let's say you now have this element you didn't otherwise have, but it doesn't have everything you need. Well, this isn't a Cloud Elements product, so what do? The cool thing about this is now you have a starting place, and we offer Element Builder, which is what you're seeing right now, our Element Builder screen, as a tool to build elements. But now you don't have to build starting from scratch. You can build from what you already have. So maybe authentication already works and you have some resources, but maybe you also needed a resource for credit card credits, and you're like, that's not there. Well, because it's not a public catalog element, you can't ask for a feature enhancement from Cloud Elements, but you can always reach out and get help extending it, or you can read the API documentation and then go ahead and add a resource. So when you click add a new resource, you will go ahead and put the resource name. So maybe this is credit card credit, and then maybe the vendor called it something different, like CCC. And maybe you only need to post credit card credit. So you just choose what you need from this, and then you go ahead and start, and it builds this new resource for you that you're able to edit and work with in the same way that you would if you were building the full element. And so in this way, in addition to all of the elements that Cloud Elements already offers, you now have a whole separate catalog of open source elements that can complement and add to your existing elements that are available. So you have access to even more elements than you otherwise would have. In addition, after I've changed the element, I can easily give back to the community. So if I added a resource to this element, I could push to my branch that I've cloned and then create a pull request against this Cloud Elements Open Labs repo, and it's a cross repo pull request. And then that'll create it here, and it'll get reviewed and uploaded. And when you do that, you just want to make sure that you have followed the standard format with the capitalization. It will automatically go alphabetical if you've capitalized it correctly. And the other thing you might want to read is this contributing guidelines, which will give you a little bit more information of what's expected from you as a contributor. But it's basically just saying, be polite. If you're going to contribute to an element that's already built, don't necessarily rip out everyone else's work or like change things that might be needed for some customers. Be constructive, not destructive. And then all of that's kind of outlined in this code of conducts and contributing guidelines that are available if you have any questions. So that's basically how you would contribute an element. What is cool, one last thing about elements, is that right now there is a process, as you saw, to get these elements from the community into your personal Cloud Elements account. You have to upload it, but currently our UI team is working on adding community elements to be available and visible within the Cloud Elements UI. You would have our public catalog, and then just a place that you can click to get the community elements. It's still important to note that they are contributed from the community, so they might not have the same standardization as other Cloud Elements elements, but they are available as a starting place, and you are able to, again, extend and add to any of the elements that you would get from that community elements. And that would be an extra enhancement that you might see soon, that you can just get them from your existing Cloud Elements account rather than having to go import them manually. Okay, so the next thing we're going to cover is VDRs. So VDRs, or our virtual data resources, are super powerful. They give us a way to control how our data looks and behaves so that we can use our data the way that we want to, rather than having data the way the vendors send it and the way that they expect it and want it. This lets us control our environment and our ecosystem in a much more robust way. However, while VDRs are powerful tools, there's always things we hope we can do with our data that might be harder to accomplish, and our goal with this repo is to provide samples of different ways to solve difficult problems. So if I was thrown into a problem, like how would I change my data to look like this? How would I make this behave the way I want it to? And then I was able to solve that problem, I can then contribute that to the VDR section of Open Labs and share what I solved. And in doing this, we not only contribute back to the community because we're all solving difficult problems, and while they're all different problems, there's overlap in the actual problems that we run into. But in addition, I might actually get a lot of good feedback. So if I contribute a solution and I make a pull request, someone from Cloud Elements has to review that pull request. And while they're reviewing it, they might say, hey, this is really cool, but you could do this instead. And so while I'm contributing and giving back and found a solution, I might be also then learning other ways to solve problems that can help me and my team down the road and can make sure that I'm using best practice. So it's a way to get feedback on your work just by contributing. So we're going to jump and take a look at some of the examples, but first I'll also go over the setup and structure of the VDRs repo. So the VDRs and formulas repo were started after the elements repo, and so they're still getting built out. And so you'll see there's less that has been contributed to them, and the format is still kind of getting solidified, but also because they're a little bit more complex than just an element, there's a little bit of diversity we'll see in the setup, so I'm going to kind of go over that. But just like the elements repo, the outside folder should have a very descriptive name so that you sort of know what's going on before diving into a specific example. Inside of that folder, there'll be a README that explains the purpose or use case the sample is showing. So for example, if the use case was just a part of a VDR, like the JavaScript section of a VDR, it would need to be clear that this isn't a full VDR. So in that description, you would want to explain this is used within a VDR so that they know they have to still build out the VDR. This can just be added as a sample. If you've contributed the full VDR with a specific problem that you've solved in it, then you'd explain this part is where I solved the problem, so that it's clear when someone's going to use it what they should be looking for. The folder should also include all necessary JavaScript or JSON files needed to demonstrate and give a solid example of how to accomplish something. And the README should explain how to use these files. Okay, so I'm gonna just jump right over to the Open Labs organization and move to the VDR section. So in this section, you can see there's combining objects, post responses, promise all, pick lists, and you can choose any one of these. So let's say I was a Cloud Elements user and I was making a VDR and I realized, okay, I have this contacts VDR, but each one of my contacts has an address and the address doesn't come through, and there's an address endpoint. So maybe there's a foreign key reference, but what if I don't want to have to call every contact and then call every address and get the address that's associated with that contact? How do I make a VDR that combines these so I just have the contact and their addresses returned to me? And so I noticed in this VDR section the combining objects, and I'm like, well, that might or might not be what I'm trying to do, but it sounds like there's some hope there. So I open it up and there's a README. And the README in this case explains what's going on. So for this one, it says this is an example for users familiar with Cloud Elements virtual data resources to expand their resources to be able to combine data from various objects into a single resource. Or in other words, instead of having to make a call to a customer's endpoint and then having to make a call to an order's endpoint, you can actually specify the data you want to grab and combine it. And so when I read that, I think, okay, so that's what I am trying to accomplish. So then I might look further into this. And as you can see here, it explains how you would use this. So in this case, it even gives photos. Okay, this is where I'd click to add the JavaScript. Here's a photo of the JavaScript with things that it tells me I might need to change for my use case. So in this particular case, they have transformed object.customer ID. So it says change this to look for the field you're interested in. So maybe I don't need customer ID. For my example, maybe I need transformed object.address ID. So that when I make that second call from the contacts to get the contacts addresses, I'm actually calling that foreign key reference of the address ID. So I would be able to say, okay, this looks like it's going to work for me. And so if I look at what I have available, it also has this JavaScript. So then all I have to do is in the README, it also will show that that you actually have to add it to the JavaScript. So if you read through this, it says you'll have to build out, in this case, 2 VDRs, one to, for this example, call my orders, and one to call my customers. So maybe I call my contacts and my addresses. But it gives the idea that I'll have to build out those 2 VDRs, but then I can use this code with these minor changes to see how I'm going to pull in that required HTTPS and make that HTTP call within my virtual data resource. So that is an example of how you would read through the README of this, and why it's important to have a very explicit and thorough README so that people understand, okay, does this actually meet my use case? Because as I mentioned, VDRs and formulas are a little bit more complex than just an element. The element, you know, hey, I'm just trying to hit some APIs. But when you're using a formula or a VDR, there's very complex use cases that might go in, and especially when you're solving these difficult problems. So it's really important to walk through these difficult problems and understand how to use it. So again, in this case, if I was in Cloud Elements, at this point, I would have to say, okay, it sounds like I need to build 2 virtual data resources on my own. So I would build a new resource, and I would have the fields I need. And so maybe this one's going to call contacts, and so this will have one address ref, and this will connect to whatever element I'm calling get contacts from, and then that will have that foreign key reference with that address ref. And I don't actually, I just realized I don't have any instances, so I would create an element instance to connect to this VDR, and then in that JavaScript, I could just pull that in. So I'm just going to make an element instance real quick so you can see this. Okay, so I hop back over to my VDR that I'm making, and I can go ahead and add this mapping. And what I'm going to do, I'm not going to make both resources for this demo, but I'm going to talk through how you would. So resource 1 is the one that might be making that call within the JavaScript to resource 2. So in this case, when I added that mapping, I would really want to make sure that that I mapped the foreign key reference, because you can't call all of the addresses. So I wouldn't want to call get all contacts and then get all addresses. You can't combine it. But if you're calling get all contacts and for every contact get the address based on like the foreign key reference or whatever, or get address by ID, then you can make that single additional call for every contact. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose this instance. Okay, while this loads, I'm going to just go through. I think we have some internet problems right now. So while that loads, I'm just going to go through the next ones. So this was for the combining objects. So I'll just go through the other ones and I'll come back to that. I'm not going to go through all of them and importing them, but kind of still give you an idea, because I think it's important to understand everything that's currently available, But again, these are being expanded regularly, so you'll see that more and more have been contributed over time. So the other one, this is post responses. This one, when you look at post responses, okay, so if I just think about what that could mean, if I do a post request, what is the response? Well, typically, and you can read all of this in this README, so when you're working with VDRs, you have the option to have from vendor, which is any data that comes from the vendor, and then you have to vendor, so any data that's going to the vendor. And you can manipulate that both ways using a VDR. In this particular case, what happens if you have the information coming from a vendor on a GET call? You want to look different than the information coming from a vendor on a response body from a post call. It's still coming from the vendor. So usually if you call get contacts and you manipulate it one way, and then you post contacts and you get the response body, that response body you get will be transformed the same as the response body you get in a general GET call. So if you want these to look different, you would have to have some sort of logic to handle just transformation of the post responses. And so that's where this example would come in. So it kind of explains that in this example, we're only including the email field as this is only meant to be a proof of concept. It explains that you need some sort to identify a unique field in the post response. So this would only work if that post response had some sort of unique field that a GET response didn't have. And then in this example, it also shows that this example was built for HubSpot. So if you wanted to test it out, you could use that. And here's an example of a unique field that's being used that's only returned in a response body to a post request. And then it provides the JavaScript necessary to do this. So in this JavaScript, you can see that if it's from the vendor, so a typical GET, then we're just going to return the transformed object. And this is just to make sure that it doesn't time out if you don't have a done statement and you were getting a response. You could have a timeout issue, so you need to be able to handle the simple GET request. You have something to handle if it's not from the vendor, so if you're making a post or a patch or a put. And this is the information to have there. And then finally, and this is the important part of this, if it's from the vendor, but it has this unique property that only happens on the response body to a post, then you can handle it differently. So in this case, it says in the commented out code that this block will determine if data is coming from the vendor and the response has the property field, which is a unique field to a post response. This block will run the post response through the VDR. So in this particular case, the only thing that hits here is the response to a post. And in this case, the email is being transformed differently than maybe it would have been in this just GET call. So that's a cool example of how to solve handling just response bodies to post calls differently from response bodies to GET call, even though we only have the from vendor as an option. Okay, I'm going to hop back over here. Okay, yeah, the internet timed out, so I will just have to skip that demo for now, and I'll just continue going through this. Okay, so after post request, we have promise all, and this is similar to how you might combine objects and pull in foreign references, but let's say you had not just a foreign key reference for addresses, but you had a foreign key reference for addresses and a foreign key reference for bills and a foreign key reference for invoices. So now you have 3 foreign key references that you need to pull in. So every contact has an address, a bill, and an invoice that they need to have associated with them. But if you just pull in one at a time, you're waiting for a very long time and your VDR is going to time out. So in this case, you would use a similar idea to pulling that HTTP, that separate HTTP call, but you're going to want to do a promise at all. And what this does is it creates an asynchronous call to, and it waits till all of the asynchronous calls are done to finish the response. So it'll call out all 3 of those asynchronous calls and then wait till they've all returned. But that way it's not doing one call and then waiting for the response and then doing the next call and then waiting for the response. It'll do all 3 of them and then wait for the responses and handle it all at once. So this will provide an example of how you can do that. Again, it has very explicit photos with how to add it. It explains why you might use it, limits to this approach. So this is an important section that people have run into. So its limits are the JavaScript will time out after 30 seconds. So when you're doing something like this, you're going to have to use a smaller page size and then just maybe run it more times. So instead of 200 per page, maybe you get 50 per page and you call it a few times. But that way you're not timing out. And that's just because of limits in when you're making API calls and it's running for a long time. You want to make sure that you're set up for success. So by putting those limitations in the README, you're clear on what you're getting into as you start coding it. And then again, it has the JavaScript available to be added to a virtual data resource. And then the last one I want to go over, because it's different than some of the others, is this pick list. So this would be an example of how to handle handle data that's in a pick list within a VDR. So it's hard to map a response to a pick list in a VDR. So this gives an example of how to do that. But what's really different about this one is instead of having that JavaScript that you would then add to a VDR you built, it has the actual transformation. So it has the full right-hand side of the VDR that you can just import. And oftentimes what you'll see as these get expanded is that you might have a full VDR where you'd have even a definition, the left-hand side of a VDR that you import, and then the corresponding transformation or the right-hand side of the VDR. And you'd want to import both of these, first starting with the definition and then the transformation in order to see the full value. So whereas here, if this had been pulled up and our internet was connecting better, you would have been able to see that I built a transformation and just added the JavaScript versus actually having to just import the full VDR. So if I wanted to import a full, let's say, organization level VDR, I would actually have to use our platform APIs. So for this example, I would want to do a, first, I would want to post a definition. So I'd post the organization object name definition. So if I was, in this case, doing the pick list definition, it would be organization object pick list definition, and then the JSON that was the pick list. And then I would want to post the definition or the transformation, and that's the organization element and the key that I'm working with, transformation, and then that same object name that you use for the definition. So then I can post the transformation for various elements. So here I could post one for Salesforce, HubSpot, etc., all to the one definition. But that definition has to be there before I can post the transformation. So that's something that you'll see a lot, especially as this section gets expanded. You'll see a lot of VDRs where the full VDR is there, and you'll have to actually import both the definition and the transformation to see that value. But all of that should be explained in the README for any given artifact within this repo. Okay. So formulas. The formulas repo is a place to share useful formulas, pieces of formulas that demonstrate a specific task, or even subformulas. In some cases, you can add to a formula or an example by adding to the existing code or adding an additional JSON file that shows a second way to accomplish the same or similar results. In this case, please add to the README outlining the difference in the two formulas. And I'll kind of show an example of this that's already been done so that you see what I mean. But essentially, sometimes there's, many ways to solve the same problem. So if I solved a problem and I uploaded my solution into the GitHub repo, and then someone else ran into the same problem and said, oh yeah, this is the same or similar, but I want to do something that's slightly different, they might change it. And then in the end, they might say, hey, my solution's kind of cool too. I'm going to upload this. But rather than just overwriting mine like theirs is better, they maybe create a new JSON file saying, here's another way to solve this problem. So rather than having to make a whole separate folder that then outlines the same problem and maybe confuses people down the road, you have the one problem still that's being solved, and then a few different solutions in that same folder that are available for people to look at and decide what works best for them. So before I dive into that too much more, just to set up and structure the formulas repo, again, this one is similar to the VDRs in that it's a little bit more complex, so you'll see a little bit of diversity between the different folders, but there should be a standardization in structure. So the folders have a descriptive name. I should, as a user of this repo, be able to open it and know what each of the folders pertains to. It should have a README that explains how to use the content of the folder. So whatever I put in that folder, if I put the formula JSON, if I put some JavaScript, if I, depending on what I put in there, I should explain what I put in there and why it's in there so that users understand how to use the example I'm providing. And then whenever possible, please provide a flowchart of the formula. And this is outlined in the repo, how you could create a flowchart, but in addition, I'll show you during this webinar how you would look at a flowchart, and then I'll go over also just in the README how you create the flowchart. So now I'm going to hop over to the formulas repo. Okay, so this is the formulas repo, and here in the initial repo you can see there's a README, and this is how you do the flowcharts. So it does say if you like a visual understanding, in addition to if you like, we would prefer to have one whenever possible, and I will show you why it's really useful. So even if you don't add one, oftentimes when it's reviewed, the reviewer will add one for you. But if you add one yourself, then you also have the ability to have that flowchart just for your team or your project managers to see. It's a nice way to see a formula, and I'll show you why that is in a minute. So this just essentially shows you that that's why that has this bin file here. It's not one of the folders, and that's why it's not capitalized like the other folders. This one works with the flowcharts so that you can just do these npm installs and essentially generate your flowchart fairly easily with code that's already there. So now I'll kind of give some examples. So there's three examples in this repo. There's a getting all results from loop, how to use bulk within a formula, and monitoring the health of an element. So for example, if I wanted to say getting all results from a loop. So there's a descriptive README that explains problem this solves. So the problem it solves is how do you loop through something, get all the results from that loop, and combine them. So this is the problem statement, and then the solution is both here in words, but also available in code in this JSON file. So before I go ahead and import that JSON into my Cloud Elements, I'll see if the internet's working in a minute. But first, I'm just actually going to show you how to look at this HTML file. So this HTML file is the flowchart. So you can see it's flowchart of this loop step aggregation.html. So in if I've forked and cloned this repo, which I have this available on my local machine. So I can open a file, and again, I'll just go to Jamie Thorson, Open Labs, and this is formulas that was getting all results, and this is the HTML. Okay, so if I open that, all of a sudden I have this nice flowchart of what the formula is going to do before I even have to import it and cloud up my Cloud Elements account. I now can see what this formula is going to look like to see if it's what I want. So if I look here, there's a trigger, and if I hover over it, I can actually see this pop up that it's a manual trigger. I then come down to get contacts, and I see that it's an API call to contacts, and the instance is set up in the formula instance configuration. Then there's a contacts loop that takes the results from the steps.getContacts response body and loops through them. And then for every contact that I'm looping through, I hit this aggregator that if it's the first time I've hit this aggregator, it'll create an empty array. If it's not the first time, it'll push the contact.entry.name into this array. And then it'll keep doing that until this fails, which will happen when I've gotten through all of the contacts from that get contacts. And it'll come over here, and it'll really not do much except be done. Now, this is not a full formula, and I can tell that by looking at this, because if I just looped together all of my data, I would probably want to do something with it, like send it to an element or make an API request. I don't really just want to aggregate data and do nothing with it. So I can tell by looking at this flowchart that this isn't a full formula, but maybe a sample of what I could put into my formula. And then from here, I would then, instead of just being done, go through and add more logic of what I want to do with that, like an element request step or something. So this is a useful way to have that visual understanding of the formula, because just looking at a JSON file doesn't always tell you what you need. Then, in addition, if I'm like, yeah, that seems like it's going to be what I need, I can, I can come over to Cloud Elements, and I can go to the formulas, and let's say I'm going to build a new template. And again, if I've forked and cloned the repo, I can just import it right from my computer. Same thing, I'm going to go through. I'm already in the getting all results from loop step formula. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose this JSON file. And that is the formula. And I can change the name if I want, or leave the same one that was already there. And then that comes through just like it showed in this loop step: trigger, get contacts, contact loop aggregator, trigger, get contacts, contact loop aggregator. So you can see that that was a good visual representation. And now I have it available in my Cloud Elements account. And I can then, like I said, if I then over here didn't want to just end, I could add, what am I going to do with this data once? And maybe I add an element request step, so I can post that data to a specific element that I'm working with, rather than just aggregating the data and doing nothing with it. But that's a way that shows me, like, if I have all this contacts and I want to like manipulate it and then put it back together, how I would do that, and how I would get it from this example into my Cloud Elements account. Okay, so that would be one way, and that's again combining all results from a formula loop step. There are other examples in here, such as how to use bulk within a formula. And this one's important because this is one in which there are two different contributors who had different solutions to the same problem. So the problem being that bulk is by nature in Cloud Elements asynchronous. So you start a bulk job and you wait for a response, and then you go get the bulk job. However, formulas in Cloud Elements are synchronous. So how do we start a bulk job and then not do anything without our formula timing out? So that's the problem this solves. So in this particular case, it in words explains to you that there's two formulas, one to trigger, the one creates the bulk job, and then when that bulk job finishes, the element asynchronous callback header will trigger the second formula, and the second formula will handle the data. And so these two examples showed two different ways to handle the data. In example one, which was the original one in this one, the data was being handled through a bulk sync of records. So within formulas, there's a sync step. And this sync step allows you to just stream the data from one element to the next. And that's showed in example one. For user two, who then added example two, they were like, well, I don't want to stream it. I want to get the file and post it to my Google Drive. So all of a sudden, the use cases diverged a little bit, even though the original problem was the same problem. So then instead of just saying, well, this is the better use case, or this is the better solution, and overriding someone else's work, they gave a second example. For example two, here's what you would do. And they added their own JSON file, their own description of how to use it, and even their own flowchart. So you can see flowchart bulk 2. So in this case, we can see various solutions to solving the same problem, and we didn't have to step on anyone's feet. It was truly different people contributing new ideas to a community, rather than conflicting ideas and thinking that one solution is better than the other. So that's the goal for our community, is to really help thrive and come up with many solutions to problems. And this shows a really cool example of where that happened. Okay, and so then the last thing in this formulas repo is just monitoring the health of an element. And this one is just to say, like, if you have an element, maybe you built it yourself and your user doesn't use it as much, and after 60 days it becomes unauthenticated, so you need to just see if it's staying alive and if it's still authenticated. Then maybe you're going to monitor the health of that element. And so there's just a simple example. This one you can even just click on the README if you want to grab the HTML yourself and put it in a separate file if you haven't forked and cloned it. So you can put that in just an HTML file on your computer and open that file the same way I did, just by opening a tab and open file and then navigating to it to see that flowchart. And then in the same way, you can import that formula into your Cloud Elements account, or you can use the doctor. So, oops, not share, sorry. So that's pretty much the formulas repo. And we've now covered all of the different artifacts. One thing to note is that coming up, there is going to also be a scripts section that are scripts that can be used to do similar things, like maybe what a formula could do, like monitoring the health. You could do that via a script or a cron job. So there are other ways to solve that same problem. So that will also be available, and things are starting to get added to it. So now I'm going to hop into if there are any questions.
Yeah, we have a couple questions. So the first question is, how do I know if my VDR is something I should really put into Open Labs?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. In general, we err on the side of adding too much. So there's never really a case that you shouldn't add something to Open Labs. There's just it's less likely to be used if it's just a simple VDR, not solving a problem really, but just like, oh look, I mapped contacts to my contacts. Well, that might be useful for your use case. A lot of people need different data in their VDRs, so it's less likely to be used if it's not solving a unique problem, and that problem would need to be defined in the README for people to understand. But we don't ever tell people not to contribute. So if there's some reason why you think that your VDR would be useful to people, please just contribute it.
Awesome. How do I get help if I import an element, but I'm running into issues extending it to meet my use case?
You can reach out to the implementation team. It's implementation@cloudelements.com. And we are all familiar with Open Labs and with how to work an element builder. So if you reach out, just include the fact that it is an Open Labs resource that you're working with, and then what you're trying to extend it, and any API docs or problems or error messages that you see, and we're happy to help you.
Cool. Two more. So if I'm adding a formula, how do I add the flowchart?
So the flowchart, we actually have Python scripts to run. So you saw in that bin, there was a Python file in the README. You can just run that Python script and it'll generate the flowchart dynamically. If you have problems with that, like I said, we prefer you to add it whenever possible, but if that's a holdup, if you're like, I can't make it work, then don't add it, and someone who's reviewing it will add it for you.
Cool. And then last question, if I have just a part of my formula that I want to add to the repo, can I do that?
Yes, so if part of your formula, well, yes and no. So yes, you can definitely do that. And a lot of these, even that aggregation stuff, I would imagine was part of a full formula. So there was probably more after that in the user's formula, but they maybe didn't want their full use case outlined. So they probably just broke apart. So you can, in Cloud Elements UI, you can build a new formula from existing one. And so when you click that build new formula button, it'll say like import, start new, or build from existing. If you build from existing, then you can delete the steps you don't want to include. So you just have that like piece of yours, but then it's really important in the README to explain what that piece accomplishes and maybe how it would be added to a larger picture.
Awesome. That's all the questions.
Okay, so before we go, just be sure to join for the final part of this Open Labs webinar series. Next up is Heimdall, which is an authentication tool, and that's on August 7th. Thank you so much for coming, and we will hear from you soon.